Hello, I'm Master Marslander, and this is the Hifi Hip Dac 2. More specifically, it's my Hifi Hip Dac 2 that I've had for a number of years now, and I absolutely adore this thing. This might be my favorite thing that Hifi makes. It's not perfect, it has its problems, but for what it is, I adore it. I love it. So when Hifi reached out to me and asked if I'd like to try out the new Hifi Hip Dac 3, I said, yes, please. So the Hip Dac 3, as you can see visually here, there's not a whole lot that's changed, and that's a good thing, because I think that this is the most perfect design for a portable DAC amplifier. I absolutely love the design of the Hip Dac. With there being such a oversaturation of portable amp DACs out there, can you just think about it? So many of them are just plain black squares, little tiny little boxes, like the kind of box you put your portable toothbrush in. Absolutely no thought into the physical, visual, aesthetic design. But Hifi here, this is like, I'm a visual designer myself by profession, so I have to appreciate the design of the product here. The visual design, the build of this thing is absolutely wonderful. I love this design, this flask. It's perfect. It is just the right size to fit into any pocket. It absolutely nails having the aesthetic of a flask and having that kind of association and cool factor. It's slim, it's small, it's extremely portable, much more portable than some other amp DAC combos I've seen. And it's such a great design. I love the Hip Dac for its design so much. I want to kiss it. Mwah. It's beautiful. It's so good. And that might mean that it's earning some extra merits on my behalf. For that reason alone, the design of it is incredible. What an ingenious way to build a portable hi-fi product. I love this design. But design alone, yeah, the Hip Dac 3 doesn't change it. It doesn't change the aesthetic here, because don't fix what's not broken. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. Now, not everything is exactly the same. Obviously, there are some changes here in terms of your color, some functions on the body, interface, all that, and we'll talk about that. But in general, the shape and design methodology of this whole portable flask amplifier hasn't changed, and I'm glad it hasn't, because it's perfect in my opinion. It's so good. So, okay, great. Yeah, the build on these is immaculate, wonderful, all solid aluminium chassis here, with very, very satisfying clicky buttons to turn it on and off. Lots of different imports, lots of different functions. But when it comes to the innovation of the Hip Dac, it was the same question that we had when we had the Hip Dac into the Hip Dac 2. What exactly has changed? What's upgraded? What's different? So first, we'll talk about what isn't different. What's the same here? And there is quite a lot that is the same. Notably, power output. The power output of the Hip Dac 3 is the same as it was with the Hip Dac 2, which is still a very commendable amount of power. Out of the Hip Dac 3 or Hip Dac 2, you are getting 400 milliwatts at 32 ohms or 3.6 volts into 600 ohms. So plenty of power, enough power to easily run something like your HD 600, which is what I primarily use to kind of test the audio comparison of these two units. So yes, it can run 300 ohm impedance headphones, no problem, but it can also run sensitive devices like little IEMs. These here are the new Quiet Cs. We'll be reviewing these sometime soon. Look forward to that. But yeah, can run light, sensitive IEMs, all the way up to very, very demanding high impedance headphones. So some more similarities to both of these units. Both units have both a 3.5mm non-balanced output as well as a 4.4 pentagon balanced output. Both units support the same audio formats from DSD, PCM, DXD, and also MQA. Both feature a Burr Brown DAC, and both wield a 16-core Xmos multi-controller chipset. Over here on the left, they both have what Hifi calls their power match button. It's basically just a gain switch. You tap it to get high or low gain. Then next to that is the X bass button, or what I like to call the fun button, because this button genuinely adds just an insane amount of fun factor to what you're listening to. It is a bass lift. It's a bass amplifier, basically. But what's neat about it is that it introduces that extra bass in a very, I almost want to say, natural sort of way. It doesn't sound like this overly booming mid bass or this overly blooming bass range getting in your mid range. It doesn't sound super unnatural. It sounds like a genuine up tilt lift in your sub bass and bass range that just adds some nice meatiness and chonkiness and just this extra fun factor of bass. It's the fun button. It's the fun button. Push that button if you want to have some more fun. Okay, so that's what's the same. Now, what's different? New to the Hip Dac 3, we get metal film capacitors and a low phase crystal oscillator. Obviously, there's also the color change here. The Hip Dac 3 is going for what they're calling titanium shadow, while the Hip Dac 2 use what they called sunset orange. If you know me at all, you can probably guess which I prefer, but you know, that's a very subjective thing. If you don't like orange, you can go with the titanium. I, of course, love this finish. I have no problem with the titanium. I think it's fine, but man, looking at them side by side, it's pretty clear which one's more striking. Another difference, and actually a pretty big one, is the battery life. The Hip Dac 2 advertises about 8 hours of use, while the Hip Dac 3 now boasts upwards of 12 hours. So you're gaining 4 extra hours of battery life, and that's never a bad thing. Another big change with the Hip Dac 3 is that we are going with an all USB 3 interface here. So both for connecting to your device and for charging it, USB 3, versus the Hip Dac 2, which charged with a USB 3 but connected to your phone or tablet or whatever else through a Type A USB. And to showcase that, Hip Dac 2 had this cable, again, Type A, and would insert into that nice deep groove there, and that would be your connecting cable to your phone, whereas the Hip Dac 3 now has this simple little cable, which I could argue is more elegant. So you just have USB-C to USB-C right into your phone. It's great. It's fine. So yeah, that is a big difference. USB-A over here on the previous Hip Dac versus USB-C on the new Hip Dac. Another big change you get with the Hip Dac 3 is this little button right here on the back, which they're calling IE Match. As Hifi themselves describes it, it basically is supposed to optimize the output of high sensitivity headphones such as IEMs. It reduces hiss and enhances detail and dynamic range and improves volume control range. And all that may be true. What I've basically gleaned from this is that it more or less just gives you more gain control. So rather than just having the one button that you can get high or low gain, that power match button, what this allows is even further levels of gain beyond that. But to use it, you actually have to choose which output you want it to do its IE matching in. So right now I have it to off, which means that it will not be using the IE matching for more sensitive devices. But let's say I want to connect my quiet Cs here to the 3.5mm unbalanced jack. To enable the I switch, I actually have to switch this up to 3.5. So now the gain that is being used in that particular output is more optimized for something like an IEM, which is a lot more sensitive. And with that, using the power match button, you do get a bit more gain control. As for whether or not it does reduce hissing, I've never noticed hissing on this device with anything, with any IEM or any headphone, but maybe I don't have the most sensitive IEMs. So, you know, maybe that will help. But for me, I've never noticed it anyway, so that doesn't really matter much to me. But what it does mean is with IE Match on, I'm able to control the volume a little bit better so that it's not big gradual jumps in volume, and I can make a nice subtle adjustment with the knob. So it does have its purposes, and just a nice neat little addition that gives you more flexibility in terms of your power output. Other than that, though, there's not a lot different. And again, I don't find that to be necessarily a bad thing, especially when it comes to what they are. Portable, sick as hell looking DAC amps. Nails it. Awesome. So sure, they're great little units, but like I said at the beginning, they're not perfect. They do have some quirks. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the 3 here because it's what I've been using the most last couple of weeks. And one quirk in particular that I do have an issue with is when I'm trying to use this connected to specifically Tidal. And maybe this is something that's more of a problem on Tidal's end than it is on the Hip Dac's end. But when I connect the Hip Dac 3 to my phone, I immediately get a message saying, hey, do you want Tidal to take control of your Hip Dac? And normally you would think, yeah, that sounds ideal. Sure, I'll do that. The problem is, every time I've done that while playing around with the Hip 3, it will work fine for a while. And of course, it'll sound great. But randomly, absolutely randomly, I couldn't tell you how many songs into my listening it would happen, but eventually at some point while Tidal is taking control of the Hip Dac 3, eventually one song will end and then nothing will happen. It'll just stop. It won't move on to the next track. Or actually, no, it will. It'll move on to the next track, but not actually play it. It'll just be silent. Completely dead. The song will be playing, but there'll be no sound because it's completely silent, no output at all. And I could, pause the song, play the song, whatever. Nothing would get that volume to come out. Nothing would get it to actually produce any sound outside of actually physically unplugging the Hip Dac and plugging it back in. So that's not ideal. That's kind of lame. However, if I tell it not to be controlled by Tidal, if I just plug it into my phone and say, no, don't let Tidal take control, then it's run perfectly fine. I've not had any issues with it. So there's something going on with its connection with Tidal that's a little funky. But otherwise, that's really the only major problem I've had when playing around with the Hip Dac 3. So a lot of things are similar. A lot of things are the same. Some things aren't. Some things are new. Do any of these new additions to the Hip Dac 3 change the sound at all? Well, actually, yes, there is a bit of a change in the sound. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to compare the Hip Dac 3 to the sound of the Hip Dac 2. As I go through this, understand now that these differences are pretty subtle. There's not a huge change in the overall sound of these, but there is some. The first change is in imaging. The Hip Dac 3 actually does perform a bit better than the Hip Dac 2 when it comes to image separation. Image separation is a lot more well-defined and wider separated. Instruments are easier to pick out. There's a much better kind of a visualization of layering in the music, and it results in a more immersive kind of sound and a much more precise sort of staging. And then soundstage itself also gets slightly improved. Things do sound a bit wider in general, a bit more around you. With the Hip Dac 2, things are a little bit more intimate, so it's a bit more kind of focused and in front of you. With the Hip Dac 3, it does open it up a little bit, so it's less here and a bit more opened up. So bigger sound overall with also better imaging. The mid-range also changes, actually I would say quite a bit. Mid-range and vocals in the Hip Dac 2 were very intimate, very well defined, very detailed, but vocals in particular sounded like they were just kind of like standing in front of you, singing at you, and it was very, very nice. But with the Hip Dac 3, vocals especially sound a little more distant, a little further away. They sound, I would say, more natural, more kind of realistic. There is, I would say, a better mid-range and vocal timbre coming from the Hip Dac 3 than the Hip Dac 2. And extending from the mid-range into your mid-bass, the mid-bass and the bass range of the Hip Dac 3, I would say, are pretty definitively more detailed, cleaner, about as impactful, and not really a huge bump in the bombastic boominess of the bass range, but it just is higher performing. It's a lot cleaner, a lot clearer, more refined, and more textured. On the opposite end, on the treble range, I actually think that the Hip Dac 2 offers you a bit more information. You get a bit more sparkle and detail in the treble range with the Hip Dac 2 than you do with the 3. That being said, the 3 still does a great job. It's just maybe a little bit more rolled off than it is with the Hip Dac 2. Otherwise, they sound great, both of them. And the Hip Dac 3 has been a joy to listen to. I've been listening, like I said, with the HD 600s to make sure everything was nice and neutral. And yes, I could almost say, especially if you're using the fun button, that running the HT600 on the Hip Dac 3 was almost a tube-like experience. Not quite, of course, but closer to it than just a straight boring solid state. This actually has a really fun sound that makes a very neutral headphone sound really engaging, and it was a real joy to listen to. So it's a fantastic little portable DAC amp that is, I swear, today still the best design methodology for a portable DAC amp. This little flask design is beautiful and absolutely works. It's so freaking perfect. Oh my god. It can run almost anything. Still can't run tungsten. That's probably not too big of a surprise, but yeah, sorry, Hip Dac 3 is not going to be your solution for portable tungsten. It's not a huge change from the Hip Dac 2. If you want to save $50, I believe the Hip Dac 3 is MSRP for $200, while the Hip Dac 2 is currently MSRP for $150. So you want to save $50, go with the 2. If you want to have some extra features and a bit of a more realistic sound overall, go with the 3. It is an upgrade, just a small one, a little one, little itty bitty, teeny tiny upgrade. But yeah, I do love it. I wish Hifi, listen to me. This is the same chassis. They're the same. Give people options for colors. Like, if I could have the Hip Dac 3 in my beautiful freaking orange, I'd be so happy. Let me choose. I wish they'd let you choose. And the Hip Dac 1 had this super cool blue case. It was reflective and cool like this, but it was like this electric blue. It was so sick, but you let me choose my colors. That's all I really want to say. It's the same chassis. For goodness sakes, Hifi, let people choose their own colors. Anyway, that's about it. I hope that you enjoyed this. And again, Hifi, thank you so much for providing this unit for this review. And I'll be seeing you all again very soon.